Students. This is Ann Babson, your professor. I wanted to say a few words about the beginning of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to kind of situate you in what's going on. First of all, the beauty of this particular poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we don't really know who wrote it. It's a mystery. It was in a manuscript that was written in the 14th century, meaning the 1300s, probably around 1380, we guess. It's a pretty good guess based on everything we can see. And the poet of this, who wrote some other works, is often simply called the Gawain poet or sometimes the Pearl poet. Same person. We assume it was a man. We assume it might have been a monk who had a few areas he wanted to criticize in society, some in the church and some in the government. And he does so in a rather subtle way with stories that he tells about either how things have gone wrong or how things ought to be without naming names. He begins with references to Brutus and Troy. And if you're reading about England today as a 21st century reader, you may say to yourself, why Troy? Why Brutus? It doesn't make any sense. Aren't we sitting in an English landscape? And the answer is yes, you are sitting in an English landscape. Let me explain how Brutus and Troy end up at the beginning and also at the end. You'll see it's kind of bookended, a beginning with Brutus and Troy and an end with Brutus and Troy. As a way to understand this long narrative poem. One might even call it something of a short epic poem, but it's a long narrative poem. There was a guy named Geoffrey of Monmouth who lived in about 1200 AD. And he was asked by King Henry II, we assume, to write something called the history of the British monarchy, or the history of the British people, it's sometimes translated. And the thing about it is that he wasn't technically speaking a historian. What he was able to record rumors and legends. And it's not unusual in the ancient world, the pre-modern world, for people to think that what they ought to do is to announce in advance that if their nation is great now, that they came from a great or mythological origin. And the thing about the English is that because of their geographical location far away from Greece and Rome, where there were all these stories that educated people, not a large number of people in England at this time, but the people who had the most power would read, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're far away. They're just sitting up there on this island, and they wish to believe that they are connected to great people that came from before. So they claim to be a remnant of the Trojans in the Iliad, and that there was a guy named Brutus who ran away from Troy as it was being destroyed. And he took a boat with some of his good friends, and they went to this island up in the north, which is today's Great Britain, and that they had many adventures and legends there. He also, this man, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote this book, doesn't invent Arthur. Arthur exists as a legend. But he, how can I put it? He makes it so that Arthur's legends are recorded in a grouping that suits his purpose, which is to say, Your Majesty, King Henry, we are a great people. You can count on that. We come from the best groups of people, like the heroes of the Aeneid, an epic poem by the Roman poet Virgil that many people with educations both read and loved. It really is quite a good poem, but is not the subject of this course. But And in these legends, we see all of the elements of Geoffrey of Monmouth's recording of them. We see Merlin the magician. We see Fata Morgana, who is both a witch and possibly Arthur's sister. And we see all of these other figures. That's a book that was written a good 250 years before Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So what is the Gawain poet doing, evoking the legend of Brutus coming from Troy after the siege of Troy to England? Well, what he's doing is he's setting this up to be ready to hear all about Arthur. And anyone who had read the old book 250 years earlier, written 250 years earlier, would be completely prepared for this shift. Of course, I'm going to talk to you first about Brutus, and then I'm going to talk to you about Arthur, our greatest king ever. And the thing about Arthur in this particular beginning of the story that's very striking is that usually if I'm going to tell you a story of a great king, that king is at least 35 to 45 years old. That's a minimum age for a great king in legends. We want to imagine that our kings are somewhat wise if we think they are great in fairy tales, folklore, and indeed in Arthurian lore of some kind. But the court of King Arthur at the beginning of this poem, they're kind of wild. They're not quite, Mardi Gras at 2 p.m. wild, but they are wild in the sense that they are drinking, they're laughing loudly. The king is joining in with all of this. He's not sitting aloof and stroking his long beard because he's so wise. And the court is quite young. Sir Gawain is perhaps younger than Arthur, but not by so very much that is shocking. And the thing is that instead of having a modicum of caution, which one would expect if a giant green guy shows up in the middle of your feast and says, "Come on, cut my head off," their attitude is more like, "Dude, this is sick, dude." It is not, "Who is this person? Why is he here? And why does he insist that someone cut his head off?" That doesn't make sense. They don't really ask a whole lot of questions of him. They don't say, "We'll think about it for a week. Come back and we'll see." They say none of the things that more cautious and older people would say. And a lot of scholars have stroked their long beards and thought, why are the courtiers in Arthur's court so young? Why is Arthur so young in this story? And some have pointed out that because this story by the Gawain poet is written at a time when the plague had wiped out about a third of the population of the world, there were more young people than old people by a lot. And there was actually an underpopulation for the work that England wanted to do economically because the plague had wiped people out. There were whole villages wiped out, and things were so bad that the Catholic Church, that to this day will not let a woman be a priest. Women, for the period of the aftermath of the plague, were, if no men were present, allowed to serve communion. If anybody were a Catholic scholar, he or she would be clutching his pearls and going, "Oh my goodness, really? Oh no, how shocking." In the Middle Ages, this is crazy. This is crazy talk. But so maybe the fact that the court is young is because society itself was younger than it had been. That's one possibility. The other one is, though, that the Gawain poet might be making a comment about a current government. I gave you another video about how Arthurian legends are sometimes designed to give people a picture of a story with a current government to say that they were making unwise decisions under Edward III. And that's not impossible. That's really not impossible. They're embroiled in the Hundred Years' War over what was possibly something we might consider very foolish reasons. This really could be a problem that the Gawain poet was addressing. But what's certainly true is that their reaction to the appearance of the Green Knight, which if a giant green man showed up in your granddad's living room, would probably be really different than, yeah, dude, I'll cut your head off. Oh man, this is going to be a trip. Hey, somebody put this on Instagram. That would not be the reaction. And yet everybody just considers this part of the entertainment because they are young and energetic and more than a little drunk. In fact, you might say they're crunk. And so the story begins out crunk after telling us about the great lineage from the Trojan Wars of the British people, something that actually wasn't true.